When you see a headline like this and look at an image like that, is that the actual reason why you left Capitol Hill?
I'm not able to see what headline or what image you're referring to. I don't have it on my screen.
The Speaker
here.
of the House appearing with Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago, just as simple as that.
Well, yeah. So, it's not unusual for the presumptive nominee, really, of either party to be the leader of that party. That would not be considered unusual. What's unusual is Donald Trump himself, of course. And so that makes this an interesting moment. Of course, it's compounded by the really tenuous position that Speaker Johnson is in, which Donald Trump could make better or could make worse. And we don't know how that'll play out. This is what's unusual about this moment.
Well, and the idea, Senator, that it seems that whatever legislative issue Congress is dealing with, if Trump doesn't want to see it done, it's not done. Is it typical for someone who is not currently in elected office to have that kind of influence over actual policy and legislation?
I think you might be overstating it somewhat. For instance, I think that I'm not sure Donald Trump really wanted to see this FISA reauthorization passed, but it did. And 2/3 of Republicans, I think, voted in favor of it. And I think there's a pretty good chance that aid for Ukraine does end up passing as well. But your basic point, I acknowledge. It does appear that Donald Trump is attempting to exercise more control over the House of Representatives than you would normally expect for someone who's not a sitting president.
Well, so where do we go from here, Senator? There are great questions about what will happen to Ukraine funding, for instance. Will it depend on what happens tonight? Or do you see a world in which the Speaker of the House works around the rules, brings it to the floor, and hopes for the best?
Yeah, so I'm hoping that's what happens. And I think it's quite possible that the Speaker could persuade Donald Trump to kind of take a pass on this. There are things that I think would make good sense. That would make it a little bit less controversial among some Republicans. For instance, I think at this point, Russian assets should be used to fund Ukraine, its reconstruction, its defense of itself. The behavior of the Russian government is just so appalling and so outrageous that I think that's a completely reasonable response. As far as making this alone, it's not realistic that Ukraine is going to be able to pay back very much of the aid they've gotten. If that's somehow acknowledged in the formulation, then calling it alone isn't that big a deal. The important thing is the U.S. has to demonstrate that we're going to fulfill our commitment here. We're going to stand by a friend, a country that has been trying to break free of the really appalling dominance of Russia, has turned to the West and pursued democratic and market reforms. If we're going to abandon a country like this to a ruthless authoritarian who just rolls through with tanks, then countries around the world are going to recalibrate and recalculate what's in their interest, and it's going to be very bad for the United States. So this is really, really important that we get this aid to Ukraine done.
Well, Senator, as we have this conversation with you, former President Trump is still speaking at Mar-a-Lago. Just speaking to the position the speaker finds himself in, he says he thinks it's not an easy situation for any speaker. He thinks he's doing a good job, going on to say that Marjorie Taylor Greene, who he says he gets along very well with, understands that and has a lot of respect for the speaker. But Marjorie Taylor Greene and others as well in the House would not like to see Ukraine aid pass. There is a faction within the Republican conference that does not share the view that you have, sir. So when we think about how the Republican Party has maybe been reshaped, are we seeing something that goes from interventionist to isolationist in terms of geopolitics and foreign policy, but perhaps more interventionist in other areas, like in markets, for example, as you see Josh Hawley trying to propose an interest rate cap on credit cards?
Yeah, well, there's a lot to unpack there. I wouldn't suggest that we were an interventionist party so much as a party that acknowledged and recognized the leadership role that the United States plays and is uniquely able to play. And it has been in our interest to play that leadership role. that we've played really since the end of World War II. So there is now a faction that rejects the idea that the U.S. benefits from this leadership that we play, from the fact that we're able to build very large and broad coalitions that support each other and support us. There's a faction that rejects that idea. Donald Trump seems to generally reject that idea. And we've got to win that argument internally among Republicans. I think it's still a majority of Republicans that recognize that it's in our interest to continue to lead the world rather than leave the world and our own interests to the tender mercies of the Chinese communists or Vladimir Putin. But we've got to have that fight. And you are right. There is simultaneously a movement within the party to expand the role of government dramatically. My own view is we already have one party in this country that wants a big, powerful central government that erodes our freedom, wants to do central planning, redistribute wealth. We don't need a second party to do those things. Our party has been, for many decades, much more committed to personal freedom and economic freedom and the tremendous prosperity that comes with that. We certainly shouldn't cast that aside for some some collectivist, centralized model that's inspired by a socialist impulse that will not provide the kind of prosperity American people deserve.
Well, it seems your party has settled on a nominee, Senator. Is Donald Trump the best candidate for this country in 2024?
Well, I've been very clear that Donald Trump is not my preferred candidate by any means. He's also not particularly ideological, right? I mean, he doesn't spend time, reading, accumulating knowledge, and thinking deeply about these various constructs and ideas. He has relatively few, very fixed ideas in the economic realm or others. One, though, is he's very hostile to trade. He's very hostile to free trade, very misguided. And if he becomes president again, I think we'll probably go through a period of very difficult tariffs that will be damaging to the economy, damaging to American employment. But he seems to be on that path. In other areas, he governed as a more conventional Republican. He was big on rolling back excessive regulation. And under the Obama administration, we had massive excessive regulation. It was a good idea to roll that back. And Donald Trump certainly deserves credit for having done that. On judicial nominees, he pretty much went along with conventional Republican orthodoxy and nominated people that conservative Republicans wanted. So, in some ways, he governed as a traditional Republican, but I get that in many important ways, he is not that. It's a challenging time for our party.